Welcome to the Cycling Demystified podcast, brought to you by Foundation Bike Fit and Frequency Cycle Works, the podcast where we help you take your cycling to the next level by sharing the knowledge from experienced bike fitters, mechanics, and the hidden players from the bike industry. Hello, Wei here from Foundation Bike Fit, and we're back for another short episode, and this week we're going to get a bit nerdy on numbers. Because I know you guys love looking at your numbers. But even if you're not data driven or couldn't give two hoots about bike geometry, stick with me. Because if you understand the key concepts of what I'm about to talk about, then you're going to be able to make better bike buying decisions and ultimately save yourself a boatload of cash. Because bikes just aren't getting cheaper these days. So if you really want to avoid buying the wrong size frame, well, listen on. And this is really a continuation of last week's shorts episode. And kind of after I got a message from a rider who wanted to buy a new bike, I thought I'd peel back the layers a little bit more on the method you need to use and the numbers that you need to use to help you decide on the right size new bike for you. So let's get into it. So I had a message from a rider who we had fitted before, and he was looking to buy a new bike but just didn't know what size to get. And he didn't know what size because he didn't understand how to use his fit data or the figures that he got from it. And now this is great because clearly the rider understands that he has a good position and the position has been recorded and it can be replicated. But this is also a really common roadblock that lots of riders face. Having been through a fit process, there's still some uncertainty as to how to translate a fit across to a new or second bike. And this doesn't matter what kind of bike fit system you're using or what the output from the bike fit is. Usually there's going to be some consistency in that kind of report or numbers that you get, or some cross-referencing numbers that you can use. So if you had a bike fit, dig out that fit report, dig out the numbers, and hopefully you can find some of the numbers that I'm going to talk about today. But like the reason why we sometimes have a bike fit, and then when it comes to that kind of point of getting a new bike and not understanding bike fit data, is because it does take a bit of time to explain all of this and get the concepts right, which is kind of why we're making this podcast in the first place. Usually an initial bike fit will look to resolve a particular problem for a rider on a certain bike at a certain time. And if that bike fit is good, then we'll get through that, we'll resolve the issue. But now that this rider is no longer getting held back by their discomfort or the pain that they were having before, they can progress in their journey as a cyclist. And now they get to this point where they're looking for a new bike. And this is where most riders come a cropper. They simply think that buying the same size of bike that they're currently having in the same or different brand, and it will just be the same. Medium is a medium. A 56 centimeter bike is a 56 centimeter bike. But sadly, that's just not the way it is. Things just aren't that simple. And if you listen to my previous podcast around the fundamentals of bike sizing, then you'll actually realize what you need to consider when choosing a new bike. So I think that was episode 51. So last week's short. So if you haven't listened to that, go back, listen to that, and you'll get a better kind of gauge, or like kind of the bigger picture of what we're looking at. So how do we use our fit data to choose our new bike? Well, this is where we need to get a little bit nerdy. and start to understand your numbers. And I know this might sound a little bit intimidating for some riders, but it's actually really much easier than it actually seems. And you'll gain so much empowerment from just understanding the main concepts, that, when you go into that bike buying purchase or transaction, then it's going to be super useful for you. You don't have to be reliant solely on like a sales rep or someone telling you this or that, or all your friends who are experts who are trying to give you all their different opinions. If you have some numbers which you can kind of fall back on, and that will give you some decent parameters, the numbers don't lie, then you can stop guessing, and this is where you can actually make the right purchasing decisions for you. So yeah, give it a go. It's a bit like going to a restaurant. You guys know I like my restaurant analogies. So, and it's a bit like the difference between telling the waiter exactly how you want your steak done. Sorry for all the vegetarians and vegans out there, but if you like your steak done in a certain way, you want to tell that waiter exactly how you want it done. Otherwise, it's kind of like leaving the decision to the guy sitting next to you. Well, how they like it is not how you like it, or what they think is best may not be what you think is best. If you like a surprise, then great, get the guy next to you to order. But if you want your filet mignon, like medium rare, pink in the middle, plenty of horseradish sauce on the side, then you better ask for what you want. So, what are these numbers that you need to understand? And before we get into the numbers themselves, the key concept you need to keep in mind is that we want to separate the bike into two halves. Now, the front half of the bike, it determines kind of where your cockpit needs to be, where your hands rest on the controls. This is your cockpit, and you need to have this in a certain place. And the rear half of the bike determines where your saddle needs to be. So your bum needs to sit on the saddle, and it needs to be in a certain position. Now, front of bike, back of bike, all relate to each other, and in the middle is your feet. So there's three kind of triangulation points, but try and think about saddle position as back of the bike, hands and cockpit, front of the bike. Now, the three numbers that you need to know in order to choose the right size bike are: one, something called frame stack, and number two, frame reach. And these two numbers will determine where your cockpit needs to be, and that describes the front half of your bike. And the final number is your seat tube angle, and this obviously relates to the back half of your bike and will determine where your saddle needs to be. So how do we measure these parameters? And this is where we deviate from old school methods where you just kind of measure the tube lengths, and instead we use coordinates as our modern method of measuring. Now, it's not that modern, but just the old systems still exist. I think this was first brought into place by Dan Enfield, bike fitter of Slow Twitch fame, and he invented this kind of coordinate style of measuring, and it makes total sense. For example, it's just a much more accurate and repeatable kind of method. I think if you're using the old school method of just measuring seat tube angle, seat tube lengths, or the top tube length, that's like the kind of easiest parameter that everyone kind of latches onto, then two different models of bike can have the same top tube length, but that top tube could be positioned a little bit further forward relative to the bottom bracket, or effectively where your feet are, or further back. Now, it's the same length of tube, and if you use that to describe the size of bike, then it is exactly the same size, but the feeling of that bike and how relevant it will be for you is completely different if it's positioned further forward or further back from that bottom bracket. Now listen on, stick with me, and I'll explain a little bit more as we go through. But we also discussed a lot of this kind of concept in previous episodes, like episode 44 on weight distribution. I'll put a link in the notes if you go back. It's part of our 10 Pillars of Bike Fit series. And you'll begin to realize after you listen to that where you place your saddle has a direct impact on everything else on your bike. And it will completely change kind of how your bike feels to ride, but also your comfort depending on how far back and how far forward it is. So we need to understand exactly where that saddle position needs to be, and then stick with that, and then also understand where our hands need to be and kind of stick with that. So in order to understand the coordinates and the coordinate numbers that we need, which are stack and reach, we need a couple of reference points on the bike frame. So in order to start measuring, we need a frame of reference. And firstly, our 0 point, so where we start measuring from, we need an origin or a 0 point, and that is the middle of the bottom bracket. Now this is an imaginary point in the middle of the bottom bracket. Imagine if it's like the center of the axle. If you had a bottom bracket and an axle and a crank in the bottom bracket of the bike, then it's basically the midpoint of that. If you don't know what the bottom bracket is, it's basically where the main axle of the bike is, where your cranks attach into that frame, where your cranks spin around. Google it, you'll find it. The second reference point then, once we've established our kind of middle of bottom bracket as origin, the second reference point is the highest point of the frame at the middle of the head tube. So the head tube is the part of the frame that connects the fork at the bottom and the stem and handlebars at the top. So that kind of tube, the front tube of the bike. So if you're looking side on and you drew an imaginary line through the middle of the head tube at the same angle as the head tube, basically kind of where the steerer tube of the fork kind of goes, where that steerer tube exits the top of the head tube, that's our reference point. If you're finding this to visualize, then I'll put a link in the description below to some articles with some diagrams, and this will kind of make it clear where these kind of reference points are. So we've got our origin point and we've got our reference point on the frame, which is at the top of the head tube. And so now we've got the reference point, we can start measuring. Now frame stack is essentially a measure of how tall a bike frame is. And this is the vertical distance between our reference points. So if we drew an imaginary line from the bottom, from the middle of the bottom bracket, all the way up vertically till we reach the point where it's in line with that top of the head tube reference point, this is what frame stack is. This is our Y coordinate. And frame reach is, you might have guessed it, how long a bike is. So this is the horizontal distance between our reference point, our X coordinate. So from the middle of the bottom bracket measured horizontally to that top of the head tube point. Now, every bike will have a stack and reach measurement. If it doesn't, if you can't find it on some geometry chart, then run away, because a manufacturer who can't quote stack and reach should be avoided at all costs. This is the kind of consensus at the moment between manufacturers, that stack and reach are the ways in which we compare and measure different bikes. The key is that these are fixed universal points, and they are the same measurement point on every bike, whatever size bike it is, disregarding kind of recumbents and other oddities. So let's give you an example. I think an example might help you see how stack and reach measurements can help you compare different bikes. So let's assume that you're happy with the configuration of your current bike, and if you've got a current bike and you're happy with it and it feels good, then you can consult a geometry chart and you can find out the stack and reach numbers for this bike. You also know how long your stem is and how many spaces you have under the stem to create this good feeling of where the cockpit is. So just for example, if your bike has a reach figure of 390 millimeters and you have a stem paired to this, which is 100 millimeters long, to create your ideal cockpit. If you find a new bike and you're consulting the geometry chart and you find out that this new bike has a reach of 400 millimeters, so this is 10 millimeters longer than your existing bike, then if you want to create the same position, a handlebar position, on your new bike, then you can install a 90 millimeter stem. So that's 10 millimeters shorter than your existing 100 millimeter one. And you'll be pretty close to creating the same handlebar position. And you can apply the same principle to stack for the height of frame. So, the stack is the height of the frame, and you have a certain number of spaces underneath the stem to create the cockpit height that you want. So if, for example, your new bike has less frame stack, then you need to add more spaces on the stem. And if your new frame has more frame stack, then you need to take away a few spaces on the stem. Or figure out another way of kind of getting to that kind of point. But again, once you have those numbers, you can start to compare bikes much more accurately than just looking at traditional numbers. And of course, to calculate the exact position as accurately as possible does require a little bit more nuance. We have to consider things like head tube angle and handlebar and hood dimensions, but this does give you a very, very good place to start and start to understand how your bike, your position, compares to a new bike. I mean, in the studio, we use a CAD program to map out every position as accurately as possible. And, these aren't like kind of programs which are unavailable. Like if you're feeling really geeky, go check it out. Like BikeCAD, I think you just pay like a license, a one-time license, and then you get the program for free. And there is a free version of it. So if you're feeling really geeky, go check it out. Go have a play around. It's good fun if you like drawing bikes and doing all kinds of things, and the possibilities are pretty endless. There are some other useful comparison tools out there as well. Online things that are free most of the time. Geometry Geeks is one we use all the time, and Bike Insights. And so I'll leave a link to those kind of tools in the description below. But yeah, there's lots of stuff that can help you out there. So yeah. Once you've managed to compare different bikes and figured out what stem and spacer configuration you need, then the question goes back to what we were discussing in last week's podcast, all about the 3 fundamentals of bike sizing. Is the new configuration, is that a reasonable configuration? Will the bike handle well? does it give me enough adjustment? And this is where you can start asking those important questions. You've used your numbers, you can compare different bikes, then you can start asking the really important questions about, your new purchase. It's not just about creating an amazing position, but can you marry that with the bike handling? Will it feel good to actually ride? And does it allow you the adjustment that you need, or lack of adjustment that you need? Like, again, going back to what we were talking about last week, if we had, for example, a largish, like say 58 centimeter road frame, and you need to install a relatively short, like 60 millimeter stem to get the position that you need, then more than likely this bike is going to handle poorly. Like, that very short stem is going to create a very twitchy feel on the bike. The bike, generally, the frame itself is so big, maybe the wheelbase is going to be very long, and so yeah, you can be pretty sure that this new bike is too big, and so maybe you need to look to a smaller size and see how that compares. But if you're installing a 60mm stem on a large size modern mountain bike, then this might be just right. So you do have to consider your discipline and understand a little bit about bike geometry and how that works. And go back, listen to that kind of last week's episode if you haven't done already. And hopefully that will give you a little bit more insight. So let's move on to the final metric that you need to understand, which is your seat tube angle. So we talked about the front end of the bike with frame, stack and reach. Now we're talking about the rear end of the bike and seat tube angle. And because this is a podcast, I'll leave some links in the description below as to some diagrams just to show exactly what a seat tube angle is. But essentially, the seat tube is the tube that runs from the bottom bracket all the way up to where your seat post inserts into the frame. So it's that tube, and that tube will have a particular angle that is kind of welded or kind of created at. And so if we're looking from the side of the bike, the angle at which this tube is positioned will have a direct effect on where you can potentially position your saddle. A steeper seat tube angle is one that is more vertical, and so this will, again, if we're looking from the side on, if the seat tube is more vertical, it will pitch your saddle further forward towards your feet, towards the bottom bracket, towards the front end of the bike. And a slacker seat tube angle will position your saddle further back, behind your feet, behind the bottom bracket, away from the cockpit. And again, if we go back to episodes 43 and 44 about weight distribution and saddle setback, you'll understand that saddle position is essential. Like, getting where your saddle needs to be will determine so many different things. If you know where your saddle needs to be, you can also compensate for different seat tube angles using different seat posts with different angles or setbacks. And the setback is essentially where the saddle is clamped to the seat post can be offset, so you can position the saddle a little bit more rearward, or if you need the saddle a little bit more forward, then you can choose a seat post which has no offset and is essentially completely straight. But this is the thing that most riders get wrong, and it is not getting the front and rear parameters kind of right. Like, quite often people will get kind of one of the parameters right, and then the other kind of half of the bike not right, and then try and compensate for the wrong half in the wrong kind of way. For example, a really common mistake that we see riders making is if their frame has a reach which is a little bit too long and they feel stretched out when they're riding, they will push the saddle forward to decrease that distance to the handlebars. This solves the feeling of being too stretched out, but now creates new problems, all related to their saddle now being set too far forward, and this pitches their body weight too far forward, and they end up with too much weight on their hands, and that creates numb hands, numb fingers, aching shoulders, feeling like they're slipping forward onto the nose of the saddle, which is much less comfortable. So, if the saddle position was pretty much right in the first place, then the better solution would have been to fit a shorter stem on. But obviously, moving a saddle is easier, so people just do the easiest thing without kind of thinking about the whole consequence of the equation at all. So you do have to get the front end and the back end of the bike both right, and they will have different parameters each. So that's the main thing that you can use with your numbers to get kind of right. So if you want to get a decent position on your new bike, and you've got a decent position already on your current bike, then it's time to get your measuring tape out and start figuring out these numbers. We do have a useful article on the Foundation Bike Fit Knowledge Hub. So if you head to our website, go to the Knowledge Hub, search for how to use your measurements, then we give you the whole method, all the tools that you need, all the parameters you need to measure, and go check it out. Understand the concepts of stack and reach, and start measuring, recording your bike, and then you can go forth and start consulting geometry charts on bike manufacturers' websites. Now, I know geometry charts all just seem really confusing with this list of numbers, but really all you need is those three numbers: frame stack, frame reach, seat tube angle, to make some pretty decent decisions about your bike. So you can kind of ignore the other numbers, just look for those and start comparing and see where you get to. And you can pretty much see straight away whether a bike or a certain size will be suitable for you at all. I mean, we all get sucked into the marketing around bikes, how cool they look, how aero they are, which pros are riding which, and blah, 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 blah. And even aesthetics of bikes, I know some people who will only ride a straight up seat post, a straight seat post, rather than one with an offset on it. So, if that becomes an important part of your buying decision, then you better make sure that your seat tube angle is right so that you can get that aesthetic. Same with having no spaces under the stem. Like, can you get the frame to the right height so that you don't have to run any spaces under the stem? So take a look at the numbers. There's no point lusting after something that simply won't work for you geometrically. And in that way, you can save yourself both a lot of time, emotional energy, but also, some money in, making an expensive purchasing mistake. And as I said before, there's plenty more numbers that you can delve into when it comes to bike geometry. We can do a super geeky episode later on kind of bike handling characteristics and geometry. We talked a little bit about seat tube angle, but also about head tube angle and how that can have a significant effect on where your cockpit position. But get these three fundamental measurements right and you'll be pretty much, I'd say, 85% of the way there. As always, if you're getting lost in the numbers, come up for air, consult an expert, be that your local bike fitter, shop, mechanic who's versed in such language, or get in touch, let us know. We'd love to hear your questions and feedback, as we know. As always, we'd love to know your thoughts. So send us an email. You can hit us up at info@foundation.fit, or hit us up on the gram at Cycling Demystified, or at FDN_bike fit for Foundation Bike Fit. Hopefully that was useful, guys. And as always, ride safe and enjoy the summer. Take care. Bye.
Suffering from numb hands, tingling toes, and any other persistent discomforts when you ride? These are all signs that your bike fit could be improved. If you're bike fit curious, get in touch with Wei or Matt by emailing info@foundation.fit or finding them on Instagram @FDN_bikefit. Finally, for all your bike servicing needs, custom dream bike or hand-built wheels, go to www.frequencycycleworks.com or find me on Instagram @frequencycycleworks. Until next time, keep on spinning.